We have 4 presentations for you, followed by a response from Alan Millard. The first presentation will be from Jim Hoffmeier. Jim teaches at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, has been a speaker here at our library, is responsible for putting this program together, for which we're deeply appreciative, Jim, and is an Egyptologist, a well-published man, and is here to talk about Egyptian scribal influences on Israelite scribal practices. Now, what you will have tomorrow night is a more popular lecture, but what you have today is a little bit more scholastic, and it's an effort from some of these top scholars to put into some presentation an area of their expertise that helps illuminate sort of the subject of the weekend. As you guys are coming in, don't be bashful. Come on up. There are plenty of places to sit all around here. So come on up. We'll kick this off with Dr. Hoffmeier. Jim?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me, but more importantly, I hope you can see the screen. We're combating the elements, namely the bright light coming in the above, but we'll do the best we can. My intention in putting this program together this afternoon really is to supplement the talk that Professor Millard is going to be giving tomorrow night. And he is an expert on ancient writing, and especially writing in Israel. And the question that he raises has to do with Moses and writing and the alphabet. And so we thought it would be good to take a look at some of the aspects of writing in early Israel. And for me, as an Egyptologist who comes at the Bible from that perspective, I'm aware, as most people are, that Egypt had a dominating influence over not only ancient Israel, but in what we call the Late Bronze Age. That is the period roughly from around 1500 down to about 1200. Egypt really dominated the land of Canaan and Syria and much of the territory right up to the Euphrates River. And what's really surprising, even though Egypt is the dominant power in the East Mediterranean area, the cuneiform tablet scribal tradition that came from the Babylonians to Mesopotamia actually prevails. It was the international language and system of writing in diplomatic circles, and the famous Amarna letters from the Near East, actually discovered in Egypt, were written in cuneiform, written on clay tablets. Now, here, for instance, is one of 4 letters sent by the king of Jerusalem in the 14th century BC, writing to the Pharaoh. You would think he would have the decency to write it in Egyptian. Instead, he wrote it in this little strange language that only Professor Millard and a few others in the world can read. Now, Egypt, as I said, was the dominant power in the Late Bronze Age. And here you can see a famous stela, stone slab inscription that was actually discovered at the site of Beit Sha'an in northern Israel during the Egyptian Empire. So the people living in ancient Canaan and Syria were well aware of Egypt's presence and the impact that Egypt left on writing and various, well, as we will see, artistic motifs. Nevertheless, Egypt also must have had a significant impact through its writing, not just the cuneiform or Babylonian tradition. Egypt is primarily an ink on various kind of surface writing system. So, for instance, you can see on the right here a scribal kit, in this case a very nice ivory one belonging to King Tut, with the reed pens in it. and also with two types of ink, two colors of ink. There we go. There's the dark ink, black ink, and red ink, the two main colors used by the Egyptian scribes. And on the left you can see a limestone flake, what we call an ostrakon, in which the Egyptian language is written in the so-called hieratic script. However, the Egyptian scribal technique of writing on papyrus, of course, was the most dominant and internationally recognized writing surface, if you will. The Egyptian papyrus made it all over the Mediterranean world. In fact, the reason that we have the name of the northern Lebanese town of Byblos in the Greek name for the town derived from the fact that it was the distribution center of books, of papyrus, throughout that region. Now, as the Mesopotamian influence begins to wane towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, and we have in the 13th and 12th centuries BC the beginnings of the withdrawal of Egyptian influence, at least Egyptian military presence, at the end of the Late Bronze Age. This really opened the door for the alphabetic script to become more prominent, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow. And I would refer to Alan Millard's wonderful article, Scripts and Their Uses in the 12th and 10th centuries BC, published in a volume of essays from a conference at Haifa, University of Haifa, just recently. But so what you're seeing then is a transition from Egyptian dominance in the East Mediterranean, and similarly you have a withdrawal of the cuneiform tradition around 1200 BC. Now, I am the student of Professor Ronald Williams, the late Ronald Williams, who was an Egyptologist who also worked in Hebrew and Old Testament. And he wrote a very important article way back in 1975 called "A People Come Out of Egypt." And he documents in this essay, and along with a number of other published articles that he wrote the chapter on Egypt and the legacy of Egypt on Israel. But he says something very significant here, and he says, Israel was always conscious of her ties with Egypt, and the traditions of her sojourn there were indelibly impressed on her religious literature. He goes on to suggest that when we come to the period of David and Solomon, and we have monarchy being established in Israel, and in particular the need to organize an administration and a kingdom, what ways would you go about recording and documenting and keeping records and so on? And he believes that basically the Egyptian system was what was adopted. Now, we do have a lot of evidence within the Bible for those Egyptian influences, and I just want to review some of them. First of all, we want to simply trot out the names of people who left Egypt at the Exodus, whose names are found in the books of Exodus and Numbers and so on. And many of these names that you see here are either known to be of Egyptian origin or thought to be of Egyptian origin. And interestingly, all the names on this list with asterisks are all from the tribe of Levi. And it was noted many, many years ago, back in the 1930s, by Theophile Meek, who happens to be my academic grandfather, because he was Professor Williams' teacher, who noticed very early on that there was a surprising number of Levites whose names were of Egyptian origin. In any event, so you have all these individuals coming out of Egypt, according to the biblical tradition, who had Egyptian names. When we actually encounter Moses and he's writing in the Bible, we find that he is writing in two different ways. We have, of course, writing on the tablets of stone, Exodus 34:1. We're not told if this is being etched into stone or being written on ink in stone. I'm sure Professor Millard may have an idea on that. But more often than not, we find that Moses is writing in a book, a sefer, a scroll. And we can see this many times, and I've just put up some of the references there. Now, my point here is to suggest that from the beginning, when we have references to Moses writing, that he's basically using the papyrus, scroll, or book tradition, not the tablet tradition of cuneiform. In reviewing some of these references, my eye caught this reference to Moses writing the book of the law, and it says in Deuteronomy 31, when Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book, to the very end, he then gives it to the Levites, it says. I was caught rather off guard by that, because as soon as I read that, the Egyptologist in me remembers that when scrolls are completed, they very often have the name of the scribe at the end, saying who wrote the scroll. And I give you two. This is from the Wisdom of Amenemopi. That is its end, written by Seni, the son of the Divine Father, Pemu. Here's another interesting colophon. That's what we call these end notes at the end of a papyrus. Clay tablets also have colophons if they're connecting, especially connecting to subsequent documents. But it has come to a good end under the scribe of the treasury, Kagab, and the scribes of the treasury, Hori and Merim Ope, written by the scribe Inanna, the owner of the book. Whoever maligns this book, it's almost a curse, just like you have in Deuteronomy if you mess around with this. The owner of this book, whoever maligns this book, Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, will contend with him. That's how the famous papyrus Oberni, or the two brothers, ends. So just in looking at that reference to Moses writing a book and having this mention of the end and so on, certainly rings a little bell for me. Now, I want to move on to a couple other things before I step aside, but there are a number of areas where we see direct influence of Egyptian scribal practices in the Bible. So, for instance, the word for the writing kit, you saw an Egyptian writing kit with the reeds and the little ink wells, and the Hebrew word is keset, and in the Bible it's in references, we have it occurring in Ezekiel, but it's from the Egyptian word gesti. Gesti was the Egyptian word for the scribal kit. The word for scroll, in addition to the word sefer, we have the word, the well-known word that many people who know Hebrew will remember, the word Megillah, the scroll. That's actually the Egyptian word meja or mejel, which is probably a Semitic word from the start. That is part of the Proto-Semitic element of Egyptian. But this is the common word for scroll in Egyptian. And by the way, that's the reference we have to that should be up there is in Jeremiah 36. We also meet the sons of Shisha, who were secretaries. 1 Kings 4:3 tells us. And it's been suggested, and I think I would agree with Professor Williams on this, that Shisha is probably the Egyptian writing of Shesh'ah, which is the word for the document scribe. So here it apparently became the name of these secretaries who were part of the royal court of Solomon. So that's one. And then the last one is a little bit sketchy, but the word ink only occurs once in the Bible, believe it or not. And it's written in Jeremiah 36, where he's talking about writing on a scroll, in ink, etc. And the Hebrew word there is diu. But Professor Thomas Lambden, who is one of the giants in Egypto-Semitic studies, suggested years ago, I think back in the 1950s, and he may be right, that this word probably is, and because it only occurs once, it's hard to nail down, but the Egyptian word is riu. And he suggests that there was a little if you will, we call them typos today, between the Daled and the Resh, which look very similar in Hebrew. And so that could also be the Egyptian word behind the word ink as well. Along with writing, of course, and writing techniques, writing on papyrus and so on, other things, of course, that scribes would be using in ancient Israel and architects would be measurements. And it's been well known for a long time that the Hebrew hin, which was a very common liquid measure, you can see references in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, derives from the Egyptian word henu, which was a liquid measure. Similarly, the dry measure, the ephah, in Hebrew, it derives from the Egyptian word epet, which is the dry measure. Again, you see it in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. The Hebrew cubit seems to have inherited its basic understanding from Egypt. In fact, both the Hebrew cubit and the Egyptian cubit have the same logic behind them. That is, the cubit is the length from the fingers to the elbow, and it's made up of fingers. Four fingers equal a palm, and 4 palms equal a span, and 2 spans equal a cubit, and then if you throw on 1 more palm, you get what the Bible calls the royal cubit. We have the exact same thing in Egypt with the cubit. You can see the Egyptian hieroglyph for cubit, the arm with the elbow, and it too is made up of fingers, and the word for finger, Egyptian cheba or tseba, is the same word we have in Hebrew. The word palm is different. It's shesep in Egyptian. The word for span is derived from the same. The Hebrew appears to be derived from the Egyptian. And similarly, the royal cubit is the long cubit in Egypt. So we have a measuring system which seems to have been accommodated to the Hebrew system to the Egyptian. In the area of weights, there is a similar accommodation, if you will. The Hebrew shekel, for instance, 8 shekels equal a deben, and a deben is the main Egyptian weight. And in Egyptian, it was 8 kedets that equal a deben. And on some weights that have actually been found in Israel, the Egyptian word kedet is actually written on there for the weights. So again, there seems to be a connection with weights as well. That's that point. Now, you may know that the Hebrew language lacked numerals for writing. In fact, typically, even in the Bible, numbers are written out. So you don't write the numeral 2, you write TWO, or the equivalent. However, when it came to keeping records, and we have these at Samaria, I think, where Ron Tappy is well aware of those. But the hieratic, which is the cursive way of writing Egyptian hieroglyphs, these find their way into the record keeping on Ostracon. And this rather sketchy picture is actually one such example found at the site of Kadesh Barnea, where the Judeans are actually using the hieratic to write numerals. So when you put all these things together, weights, measures, numerals, the papyrus tradition, I think it's quite clear that there was some sort of significant influence. Now, I just want to end with pointing out that when you're working with scrolls, of course, scrolls would be rolled up and sealed and sent and dispatched. And typically these would be sealed with a little ball of clay and pressed on them with the name of the scribe or the official who is making the document. And you can see examples, and I'll show you one here, where you can look at the underside, and these bullae, as we call them, these clay seal impressions, were actually pressed onto papyrus. And you can see on the undersides the rough surface of the papyrus, and in the one circled, you can actually see the line that represented the string that actually tied it up. Now these are well known. These are all from Jerusalem. Of course, the papyrus is long gone. They have not survived, but the clay has. Now, one more thing, and that is the seals themselves that made the impressions, or the depictions, the images on the seals. As you can see with this one from the Northern Kingdom, has very good Egyptian motifs on it. So you have the winged scarab. This Israelite official is dressed wearing an Egyptian wig, an Egyptian gown, holding a lotus flower a staff. You can see here's another one, again with, sorry, you may not be able to see it so clearly here, but there's a winged scarab. And here's another winged scarab, and this one's a seal of King Hezekiah. Good King Hezekiah actually using not only the Egyptian winged scarab, but also the Ankh signs, the key of life, on his seal impression. Now, what's puzzling to me is that these little clay seal impressions, and I've been asking around, and Tom Davis is smiling there because he found these in North Sinai. These seal impressions, to my knowledge, are lacking in the late Bronze Age levels in many of the Canaanite sites. I spoke this week via email with Aaron Burke, who's been excavating at Joppa, an Israelite site in Israel, but run by the Egyptians in late Bronze Age. They find no seal impressions. Similarly at Beit Shan, which was an Egyptian outpost, none of these have been found. So it's very curious why we don't start finding them in the archaeology of Israel until we get down to about the 8th century. They surely were there earlier. These are from the 14th century that we found them in North Sinai. So we know they existed in this part of the world. None have been found. So we have a gap in our knowledge. It would be nice to close that gap and see if we can see a continuity of the Egyptian writing tradition from the late Bronze Age down through the Iron Period. But at least I think we can suggest that the Israelites owed quite a bit to the Egyptians in terms of their writing traditions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, our speaker is Bill Schniedewind. Bill is out at UCLA. Bill is one of the ones, when we were painting this chapel, we were struggling for how to paint the Ten Commandments in the second archway. Because if we were looking for a script that would have been useful and readable by Moses and others who could read in the, say, 13th century, in the 1200s, what would the script have looked like? The typical Hebrew script that we read in Hebrew Bibles today, or if you go to Jerusalem and you're reading a printed script, it's generally going to be this Aramaic script. But that didn't become part of Israel's heritage until really much later, probably sometime during the exile. So we were really struggling, and one of the folks that really helped us determine what script to use in painting this was Bill Schniedewind from UCLA, and he and his wife Jean just got into town about 5 minutes before this started. So they woke up at like midnight in LA and have flown here. So would you join me in welcoming Bill Schniedewind?
Well, thank you, Mark. I'm really pleased to be back here. I was here before it was painted, and it's nice to see it all painted up now. And I'm especially delighted to have such an august group of people to speak with and share some new ideas, particularly Dr. Millard, whose work I admire so much. I worked out with Professor Hoffmeier an idea of giving something a little bit old, a little bit new here, and you're going to be the guinea pigs for a few new ideas about that I want to present to you today. They start with what I would call 3 niggling problems. These are things that I've been thinking about for sometimes a little bit, sometimes quite a long time. Things that have always bothered me or have begun to bother me more and more. And they're problems that can be related to the issue of the veritable King Solomon, whose the subject of so much scholarly discussion these days. Did Solomon actually exist? Is he fact or fiction? How much can we know about King Solomon? So the problems are the spread of the Phoenician alphabet, the new carbon-14 dates that we keep getting out of the Negev, and the site and the inscriptions of a place called Kuntilat Ajrud in the Judean Negev. Let's start with my problem of the Phoenician alphabet. The problem with Phoenician is that it only has 22 letters. It has 22 consonants. Why is that a problem? Well, for those of you who study Hebrew and Semitic languages, you realize that Hebrew has at least 25 consonantal sounds. Likewise, Aramaic had more than 22 consonantal sounds, and yet throughout the Near East, beginning somewhere around the 12th century, we get this alphabet spread from south to north that only has 22 alphabet. Everyone uses this, what I would call somewhat inadequate alphabet. And we have earlier versions of alphabets with more letters, like at Ugarit, where we have a 30-letter alphabet, or the new inscriptions from Wadi el-Hol that date back as far as 2000 BC that have an alphabet with more than 40 letters, much more adequate alphabets. So why do we have only 22 letters? Now, another thing that's always kind of bothered me about this alphabet is one of the main sources that we have for them are Phoenician arrowheads from the 12th and 11th century. And if we're talking about the 12th and 11th century inscriptions, there aren't that many 12th and 11th century inscriptions. More recently, we found a few more, but if we go back a couple decades ago, one of the main sources were these strange arrowheads made out of copper or bronze and engraved with letters. One of my favorite letters I'm going to point to you. I'm not going to talk a lot about paleography. Uh-oh. Is there like a pointer? The middle button. Maybe I'm pointing like, oh, that's pointing at me. Oh, there you go. Yes, I like this. It looks like an H, or if you turn it on its side, because it's actually turned on its side, it's like a large I-beam, like the letter I is the letter Zion for Zakor. Now, the questions are, why are these made out of bronze or copper? And where did all this copper come from? Why did they decide that, we're going to write a bunch of special objects with writing on it in a period when we don't have that much writing? They seem like very symbolic objects written in copper with Phoenician script. Now, one of the more interesting recent discoveries, and I think Professor Tappy is going to talk about it more, so I won't talk about it too much, is a new ostracon known as the Caiapha ostracon from a place called Kirbet Caiapha. And you can see it a little bit better here in this drawing done by Ada Yardeni from Israel. It's an interesting early Hebrew ostraca, or so-called Hebrew ostraca. But is it really a Hebrew ostraca? That's an interesting question that people have discussed. There's some interesting problems to this ostraca. It's one of the early ostracon. It's one of the early examples we have of writing, but here's the equivalent of the letter A, or Hebrew Aleph. It's written on its side facing right. Here's the letter Aleph again, written facing down, and again facing down, but then again here's the letter Aleph facing up. It looks kind of like my daughter when she was about, 5, 4, and she was learning her alphabet. Not exactly the most inspiring example of scribal technique. There are some things about the ostraca that look Hebrew, like the first two letters here seem to be it's written from left to right instead of right to left as Hebrew normally would be, but it seems to be the word al and then ta'as, the Hebrew word to make, la'asot, to go, or to make, or to do. Scholars have said, well, this is a distinctively Hebrew word, so this is a Hebrew inscription. Not really true. A few different problems with that interpretation or classification. First of all, the Ostracon and the site look to me like it's 11th century, so it's pre-Solomonic. It's also at a period when the language itself is in a formative stage, but also is a question of how you classify textual artifacts. And from a linguistic point of view, when you study linguistics, what you study is speech. You don't study writing. If you want to find out about a language, you study speech. And if we say, well, how do we classify Chinese? Is Chinese one language? It is if we classify it according to its writing system, but not if we classify it according to its speech system. And writing, I think, is generally misunderstood as sort of an easy surrogate for speech. But the problems between writing and speech, between dialects and language and writing systems, are much more difficult and complex. And scholars who study linguistics of writing systems would tell you that writing systems are a code. They're a shorthand. In this particular case, the code that we have is still Phoenician, right? They're using a 22-letter alphabet. They haven't nationalized it. They haven't localized it in any way. Now, there may be traces of local dialects, like the word asa, but of course this is a word that's also used probably by the Moabites, probably used by the Edomites. It's not necessarily Hebrew in its dialect. Now, this is supposedly a Hebrew or Judean site, but that's also something that I have questions about. Now, why is this important? Partly because there's a big debate among scholars, particularly Israel Finkelstein of the Tel Aviv University, who wrote a book In Search of Solomon and basically didn't find him. He gave an example of one biblical verse which he kind of said the entire Solomonic story is built on. That is 1 Kings 9:15, which people had dated to the 10th century, and he said that, was the foundation of Solomon and his administration. But he argued that this verse didn't hold water. And what he was talking about are the so-called Solomonic gates at Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo, which are mentioned in 1 Kings 9:15. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, and then way down here, who can see that? Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer happen to have three similar gates from an architectural point of view, and therefore they were dated to the time of King Solomon. I think, however, this narrow look at this verse is really problematic. I think we need to have a larger literary context of this verse. Now, the whole chapter, when I look at it, has all kinds of stuff about building. A longer discussion down here about Pharaoh of Egypt coming to Gezer. It has Solomon also fortifying other cities like Lower Beit Horn, Baalath, Tamar. Has stuff about garrisons. And I think if we discover some of the techniques of ancient scribes and how they used sources, we can actually ferret out what the original source might have looked like. And here I want to give you one very good, easy example of one scribal technique. And this is the use of repetition. One of the well-known parallels in the Bible is the book of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, right? So the book of Chronicles is written in the Persian period, Samuel, Kings, written in the Iron Age, maybe a couple centuries or more before that. And Chronicles uses Kings when it's interpreting. And rewriting the history of Israel. And if you look over on the left, you have 1 Kings 14, 25 and 26. In the 5th year of Rehoboam, Solomon's son, right? It's about 925 BC. Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and all the treasures of the king's house. Chronicles is using this as a source. You see, he starts exactly the same. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. Why? Because they had been unfaithful to the Lord. And then he has a long insertion discussing the unfaithfulness. And then it comes back in verse 9, which is just below, where you could actually see, right? Who can see down here? King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord. So he repeats the verse from the beginning, which was that Shishak came up against Jerusalem when he wants to resume the text. And so you have a framework where the scribe is telling you, he's telling you, I have this source, I want to explain something. We know that Shishak came up against Jerusalem, but why? Because they'd been unfaithful to the Lord. And he gives an explanation. Now, once we see the principle of repetition as a way to incorporate a source, let's go back to our text in 1 Kings 9:15 and read it again. This is the account of the forced labor which Solomon conscripted to build the house of the Lord, his own palace, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and then a digression about Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and then in verse 17 it says, so Solomon built Gezer. He's repeating what he already said from earlier in the verse, and then he goes on and he continues with a list of the things that Solomon did. So the verse 16 then becomes an interpretation interwoven into, I think, an earlier list. And that's important because if we know that there's an interpretation, then it also tells you if there's an interpretation of the text itself is that the interpretation was woven into was an earlier source, right? And we can also sort of ferret out, what was going on with this interpretation if we look at the Josianic or the late 7th century editing of the Book of Kings. And one of the guiding principles of Kings is going to be a critique based on the law of the king in Deuteronomy, where it says, when you get a king, this king shouldn't go down to Egypt to acquire horses for themselves or wives for themselves or silver and gold in great quantities. And of course, this is exactly what Solomon did in general. And Pharaoh's daughter is the epitome of this because she's an Egyptian. He's going down there. And of course, Egypt is also famous for its gold, its silver and gold. So that brings us to the later editing. But I'm still kind of curious about some earlier strata that I want to ferret out of about King Solomon. And when we read the Book of Kings, there's gold here, there, and everywhere when it talks about Solomon. It's part of the critique of Solomon because he broke the law of Deuteronomy. So, it's sort of epitomized here in 1 Kings 10:21 when it says, in Solomon's day, all the drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house were of gold, and nothing was made of silver because it wasn't worth anything in the times of Solomon, right? But the interesting thing is, in the last 10 years, we've been excavating in Tom Levy of the University of California, San Diego, has been excavating in a place called Kerbet Ein Nachas, which have the largest copper mine excavations known from the Near East. And these copper mines date to the 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th century. And they're enormous. So I'm thinking to myself, if these copper mines are so huge, where's the copper in the Bible, right? Interestingly enough, I started a search for copper. I don't really find it very many places. But there's one chapter in the Book of Kings in chapter 1 Kings 7, where it talks about the Solomonic temple, and I just highlighted all the word bronze or copper. It's the same word in Hebrew. As you know, bronze is just a copper alloy, right? And throughout the 1 Kings 7, beginning in verse 14 all the way down to about verse 50, you have the description of the building of the temple, not in gold, but in bronze. Why bronze? I think that this is the only place in the description where bronze is central. And if we actually go a little bit further to the end of the story, at the end of chapter 7, it says, the weight of the bronze was so large that it couldn't even be determined, which would fit very well with what we know was going on archaeologically at that time. But then it goes back to the sort of previous story where, so Solomon made all the things in the house of the Lord, golden lampstands, golden tables, everything's made out of gold. All the work that Solomon did in the house of the Lord was finished. He did and everything that David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels stored in the treasuries of the Lord. It goes back to its old theme of gold, because that's what people would have related to when this book was being edited at a later time. But you see in the chapter some of the early fragments about in the story about Solomon's use of gold. And it brings us back to this site of Kerbet Ein Nahas. This is a site in the Negev, south of the Sea of the Dead Sea, about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea. And the C14 dating of this site, here you can see there's a nice little fortress up on the top, and you can see the aerial photo of the fortress. The C14 dating of this is all 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th century. It overlaps, of course, King Solomon. But the niggling thing for me is that it actually starts slightly before King Solomon. And it's not just true of the C14 dates from Kerbet Ein Nahas, but also the carbon-14 datings that they've gotten from a number of other places. Bruins and Van der Plich point out that the carbon-14 datings indicate that the establishment of the fortresses and related settlements in the Negev highlands appear to predate Solomon. Right? This is my second little kind of thing that I'm thinking of. We do have some evidence for King Solomon's sources, but things seem to start before King Solomon or even King David. One other thing about our early source that I'm very interested in 1 Kings chapter 9, and it gives this list of Gezer, Lower Beit Horon, Baalath. It has a place called Tamar in the wilderness. And where is Tamar in the wilderness? Most people have associated this place with a site called Ein Hat Seva, which was excavated in the 60s, but now has been re-excavated in the last few years. There's a forthcoming article by Craig Bowman and a number of other people on the excavations there. And Bowman and his colleagues also have C14 dates, and they also begin with the 11th century. That is, they predate Solomon. They also correspond with Solomon as well, but they predate Solomon. And we can go on to other places in the Negev as well, and other fortresses. For example, the site of Arad, which is mentioned in the the wall of the temple at Karnak. The wall of the temple at Karnak of Pharaoh Shishak mentions a number of cities in the Negev that Pharaoh Shishak destroyed. Why did he destroy all these cities in the Negev? What was he? It always sort of was a big question about 10, 15 years ago when I was a student, or 20 years ago actually. I'm getting old, aren't I? 20 years ago, we studied these lists. I'm thinking, what the heck was Pharaoh Shishak doing with a list of dozens and dozens of cities in the middle of nowhere that he destroyed, including, the outpost of Arad was actually one of the bigger ones. But Arad's really important because at the site of Arad, there were over 100 Hebrew ostraca. Here's a nice example of Egyptian scribal shorthand in one of the ostraca. This is ostraca number 34 from Arad. But one of the ostraca for my topic that I'm really interested in are 5 Arad ostraca that are associated with the strata 11 and 12, which were originally dated by the excavator to the 10th century, and I think should be continued to be dated to the 10th century. Interesting things about these ones. Here's Arad 76. They use hieratic numerals and abbreviations. In other words, they're using already in the 10th century Egyptian hieratic, right? Probably borrowed from the Egyptian administration that had gone defunct. There are interesting orthographic features. Here's the letter Zion I have circled right here. The letter Z. It looks like an eye bolt here. And that's important to me because I'm going to date things by their paleography. Or by the science of how letter shapes change. And if I look at another inscription from Arad, here is an inscription from stratum 10, which is usually dated to the 9th century. I look at certain features. One of the features right here is a Zion. Now you notice the cursive elements to the Zion. You see how the little hooks on the end of this? The letters are becoming more and more cursive as the administrative hand gets more and more used to writing things. Whereas if we go back to here, we have this very upright, long I-beam kind of Zion, which is very typical of the 10th century. It's the same kind of Zion we saw, for example, on the Phoenician arrowheads that dated to the 12th, 11th century. And there are other features of this. There are kind of mixed features of this. So, like, for example, this Kaf right here looks kind of early, but the Resh here looks a little bit late. But that's, getting us into all kinds of details that we don't need to discuss right now. But I want to give a couple more examples here of other things that may relate to the administration of Solomon and his predecessors that have been, I think, misunderstood. One is the fort at Tel Khalifa, which I think can be associated with Etzi and Gever, one of the ports that King Solomon allegedly made. Now this site was reinterpreted by Gary Pratico in his Harvard University dissertation, arguing that the original interpretation of it as a Solomonic fort was wrong. And that actually this was a later 8th, 7th century fort. The problem with this reinterpretation, first of all, it was based on a relative chronology about pottery that's no longer correct in light of the carbon-14 dates that we get at places like Kirbet Nachas. But the other problem is when you look at some of the materials from Tel Khalifa, you get a lot of copper objects. You get copper ore slags, copper nails, copper fishhooks, copper foil, copper weights, copper arrowheads that are not typical of later sites and certainly not in the quantities at a remote place like this. Now, it's pretty easy to understand this material in light of places like Kirbet Nachas, which is this huge mining operation, or even a place like Timnah, which is in recent another mining operation that has also been dated by carbon-14 now to the 11th century BC. All right. That brings us to my last niggling issue and the smoking gun, if you will, for me. I've always been very disturbed by a place called Kuntiladaj Rud. It's, as you can see here, it's in the middle of the desert. It's in the middle of nowhere. And there they found some really interesting inscriptions about Yahweh and his Asherah and Yahweh of Shomron. And because of the mention of Samaria and because of the personal names on the inscriptions, people dated this site to the Israelites, to the northern Israelites. And generally, most of the inscriptions dated to, that were published, they look like they date to the late 9th, early 8th century BC, and they were correlated with certain wars between the Israelites and the Judeans that we don't have to get into. Now, the site publications of Quintillage Rude were just published this year. And reading through them, they have a number of really interesting problems. First of all, there are two inscriptions. One of them, I just brought you one of them here, that the authors said, and I agree with them, that look like they're paleographically should be dated to the 10th century. But the other problem is they use theophoric names or personal names that are typical of the northern kingdom of Israel. In other words, they use this name Yah or Yao instead of Yahu or Aya, which is typical of Judeans. So the other thing is they don't have very many carbon-14 dates from this place, but they have one short-lived sample of carbon-14 that dates by the new Oxcal dating to the, I redated it with some help using the new Oxcal dating, but it dates to the late 10th or late 11th or 10th century. Even in the publication, it dates to the 10th century, but the authors basically ignore it because it doesn't fit the thesis, which is this site is has to do with civil war between Israelites and Judeans in the late 9th, 8th century. But what if it doesn't? What if this site was really established by the Israelites long before, going back to the 11th century even? That it's associated with all the other Negev sites that are C14 dated to that point. What if these two inscriptions can't just be dismissed as archaic or problematic, but they actually do date to the 10th century like they seem to date to the 10th century? That brings us to a whole interesting new set of conclusions. And here I'm just kind of trying these out on you as guinea pigs. Here's sort of my final 6 observations. First, the C14 dates from the Negev require a pre-Solomonic development of administration by the Phoenicians and the Israelites. Second, the utilization of a defunct Egyptian administration suggests sort of continuity between the Late Bronze and the Iron Age in this administration. And this includes the work that Professor Hoffmeier was talking about. Why did the Israelites use Egyptian, hieratic, and all these influences? Because it's sort of dovetailing. Solomonic administration is dovetailing on the end of the Egyptian administration. Third, the Phoenician bronze or copper arrowheads suggest that there was a Phoenician participation in the copper mining. Sort of all of, stories in the Bible about Solomon and the Phoenicians and the temple, right? Third, the Negev fort system requires a commercial partner for the Phoenicians. And finally, sort of the smoking gun, the Quintillage Rude settlement and inscriptions suggest that it was the Israelites, the northern Israelites, and not the Judeans and King David and Solomon, who first facilitated the commercial activity in the Negev. So that you have, in some ways, not a question of whether David and Solomon existed, but David and Solomon did exist. We have sources for them, we have fragments of the sources. But actually, it's a century or two earlier than David that you begin to have the development of a kingdom, Judean and Israelite kingdom, and the northern kingdom was the more natural partner for the Phoenicians and really developed through the development of the copper trade. We have the beginnings of the first Israelite administrations and kingdoms in Israel. Thank you.
Okay. What we'll do is after Ron goes, we'll have Professor Millard give his reply. Then we can do the Q&A. after Professor Tove, but we'll have you, Professor Millard, because these first three speakers are earlier in time period, if you'll be prepared to respond to them. And then Emmanuel Tove will bring us a little bit later because he'll zone in more on the Dead Sea Scroll scribes and the practices at that point, which brings us to date. So here's Ron Tappy coming up. Ron teaches in Pittsburgh at the Theological Seminary there, is not only a native Virginian, but someone who's seen the U.S. in a VW van. He has a PhD from Harvard, knows this stuff cold. It's an area for him. We're honored to have Ron with us today. Thank you, Ron.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Mark for sponsoring this and for all the people who were involved in organizing it and for inviting me. This is my first time here, and I, like everybody else, think the place is stunning. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm excavating a site in Israel called Tel Zayit. And this is the Tel in the springtime. I'm always, of course, grateful to those who support my work. And I know Andy Vaughn is here from the American Schools of Oriental Research. We're affiliated with them and with the W.F. Albright Institute in Jerusalem. And, of course, my own home institution, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Now, this is Israel, of course, north at the top, south at the bottom. You see the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. We put in a few sites here. You can see where we're located. This is the first point I want to make, that we're down here in what the Bible calls the Shephelah, the lowlands. We're neither on the coast nor in the mountains where Jerusalem is, or the coast out there, the Philistine coast where Ashkelon is. So that we're neither fish nor fowl. We're in between, in a kind of liminal zone. I'll come back to that in just a minute. This is the site looking south. You can see on the east side of the site over here a very steep slope. The western slope of the site comes around very gradually. Actually, it forms a huge arm, an earthen berm that comes around and enclosed the lower city. So we had a city on the Acropolis and the lower city. This wire diagram gives you a bit of a better idea how that earthen berm comes around toward the wadi, which drains by on the north, the main Tel up there. Now, this is an aerial view of one part of the site that we have excavated, and this happens to be the set of squares that I want to concentrate on today. These squares on the eastern shoulder of the site, and then this trench coming down the steep eastern slope that I want to look at. A grid pattern showing our excavation areas and some of the sections that we're working along, these red lines and other areas that we've worked on. But right here is the area that I want to concentrate on today, particularly that square right there. I'll come back to that. Here's an aerial view of that eastern slope and the steep, or the eastern shoulder and the steep eastern slope. Now we have a very nice lineup of stratigraphy from, let's start from the bottom and earliest date and work our way up. From about the 16th, 17th century BC, this is right at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, coming into the Late Bronze Age, coming right on up through all of the centuries, 14th, 13th, then on up at the top you'll see late 9th century in this square right here. So a very nice unbroken sequence of depositional history. One interesting thing that you'll note right away is what happens between these squares and this square. Even though they're juxtaposed physically, there's 200 years that have gotten lost here somewhere. There's an occupational gap at Tel Zayit. We don't have very much at all in the way of coherent depositional remains from the 12th or the 11th century. So we jump from the 13th century down to the 10th century in this square right here. In that sense, our stratigraphy follows very closely that of the site of Lachish, or Lachish, which is just about 7 kilometers south of us. And many of you will know that as one of the main cities of Judah, royal cities down here in this part of the world, a little bit later on, after these remains that you're looking at here. So this is the area that we want to look at. You can see right here, I hope this is clear enough, the erosion line. Because we're on the edge of the site, there's heavy erosion here. And so a lot of these remains have been washed away. You can see the edge of the architecture that survives here at the bottom. Down here you can see the line beyond which the remains have just been sheared off by the heavy volume of water that has come down this eastern slope. Now, it's this square right here that I want to look at in some detail. And you can see these other squares right here. The chronology for these squares, get used to my pointer here. Let me back up here one time. Right here you can see some architecture, some rooms right here, the back room of this building right here, fragments of walls right there. Because this is on the eastern shoulder of the site, this is basically what is preserved, but have reason to believe that the rest of the building would have gone out like this. Of course, that's gone down the hill by this point. But we have a tripartite building here with a broad room in the back. Very standard stuff in the archaeology of Israel, and has been found many other places. This is the level that we want to look at here. The stratigraphy for those squares on the eastern shoulder, we have a number of major strata and then some subphases as well. And interestingly, even though we're somewhat similar to Lachish in our depositional history, we actually have a little bit more than they have at Lachish, actually, because this site was dramatically destroyed by fire 3 times over the course of the divided monarchy, late United Monarchy, divided monarchy. In other words, at the end of the 10th, 9th, and 8th centuries, we have a major destruction level by fire. And we have good carbon-14 dates for these levels down here. It's this level right now, preliminarily called local level 3, that I want to talk about. That's where we discovered an inscription in 2005 that comes into play with our topic at hand today. You can see, maybe, I don't know if you probably can't see through me, I'm dating that level to King Solomon, to the 10th century. And then this next destruction, we believe, occurred during the days of Jehoash, and the last one during the days of Hezekiah. Now, in terms of who's responsible for these, almost certainly Sennacherib during the days of Hezekiah. I think very clearly Hazael there for that late 9th century destruction level. The question is, who destroyed the site at the end of the 10th century, shortly after the rule of Solomon? There are a couple of good candidates. I've put Pharaoh Shishak on the board. He's certainly among the candidates, but it's not conclusive that he's the one who destroyed this site at this point. But he's one of the main contenders for that accomplishment. Now, this is square 019. This is in the very first season when we opened it. We hadn't been excavating it long, just starting down. As you can see, various things starting to appear, stubs of walls and so forth. I got interested in this corner right over here because of this huge monolith whose head is sticking up out of the ground. I thought that was in situ, probably went down and was connected to some stable architecture. And I also saw that the area was heavily burnt. I saw large chunks of mud bricks floating around in this burnt debris. And so I thought we probably have a destruction level here. So I let the rest of the square go, and I concentrated on this northeastern quadrant of the square. We opened it up, and sure enough, the monolith did go down. It was connected to some walls, a flagstone pavement. We continued to work there over the next season. And you can see 2 rooms here with this monolith in the inner wall, inside the structure. This is a beaten earth surface and a flagstone surface over here with a doorway connecting them. I hope you can see that, the walls of the building and then the cross wall back here for the back room. Now, it was in, actually, I'll show you before, this wall right here, and that gap right there, because by the time this photograph was taken, we had already removed the stone. But right there in that wall, we discovered this rock. And it's an incised rock, has an inscription on it. And this was in July 2005. I came home, we studied the stone a little bit, the inscription. We made the announcement on November 9th, and it was in the New York Times and so forth. And became an interesting topic of discussion because we were dating this level to the 10th century. Now, when we come to look at this inscription that I'm about to show you and the site in general, we have a couple of challenges. And I changed the slide last night because I had the title of this slide, Problems. And I don't like problems, I like challenges. And challenges we can meet, we can try to address by certain means. And so I want to mention 2 challenges of interpreting everything at this site. today, not just this inscription. One is location and liminality. Being caught betwixt and between. I said we're not down on the coast. We're not up in the hill country. We're caught in that area in between. So what cultural group are we looking at here? Are we looking at the Hebrews from the highlands or the Philistines from the coast? This is an interesting, good question. So location and liminality. And then more specifically related to the inscription itself, letters and language. Professor Schniedewind spoke on this a little bit. Letters and languages. So it's a difference between having your ABCs and then having something written with that toolkit. You're talking about two different things. If all you have are the ABCs, that is, if all you have is the toolkit itself, then it becomes a little bit more challenging to interpret it. But I think we can address both of these problems. The first one, location and liminality, I address through archaeology, and I'll come back to the second problem later on. I'm building on old anthropological work here when I speak of liminality. Liminal zones, liminality, this is a very popular term in many, many circles today, not just archaeology. But I'm going back to the work of Arnold van Gennep, a Dutch anthropologist at the beginning of the 20th century. He's the one who coined the phrase rite of passage. And Carl Theodor Jaspers also used the liminal concept in his work. Following on Van Gennep's work, Victor Turner at the University of Manchester in England, and then at Cornell in this country, and finally my alma mater, University of Virginia, stole him away from Cornell. But Victor Turner made great use of the term liminal zone, liminal ritual practices, and so forth. Now, here's what I'm talking about in terms of liminality at Tel Zayit. As you can see, we're on a major juncture at an interesting intersection for these major north-south routes. And this is based on archaeological survey data that have been put together. And you can see that these routes more or less converge very near our site. And so that puts us on a major thoroughfare going north-south. The ancient road system is a little bit more complex when you look at the east-west roads, but we see three major roads here. It turns out that these three roads follow three valleys, so the roads are following the topography of the land, of course. And this is the Ela Valley, the Guvrin Valley, and the Lachish Valley. And I'll show you another slide of those in just a minute. But we're on this central valleyway. So if you were at Ashkelon, you wanted to go to the hill country of Judah and on up to Jerusalem, this would be one major access road that you could take. And you would come right by Tel Zayit and on back through places like Beit Guvrin, Marasha, and so forth, on up into the hill country. Before I started excavating the site, locals had found I don't know how many Roman milestones lying in the fields right around our site. They've all been dragged off and are on various kibbutzim now. But the point is, this is where the Roman road came by in the New Testament as well. Now, so this is what I'm talking about. This is where we're located, not up in the mountains where Jerusalem is, not down on the coast, but in this liminal zone in between. I didn't know it at the time when I studied in Israel in 1980 under this wonderful, very frightening teacher, Anson Rainey, who got me started on this. He wrote a couple of very seminal articles in the 1980s. And it really had a great impact on me, and I've tried to build on some of his work and some recent things that I have studied or that I have written about this concept of liminality. Anyway, that's where we're located. This is the first challenge to us. And so you have to decide whether you're looking at a highland culture or a coastal culture, and that feeds into interpreting everything, including this inscription that we have. Now, the old model for looking at cultures like this is a core periphery. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's centripetal in nature. It focuses inward on itself. This would be how Jerusalem relates to its cities out in the countryside. What I'm talking about is something a little bit more complex and a little bit different. I'm talking about adjacent cores whose peripheries collide. And what I'm interested in is what happens when those peripheries collide. Who controls the gray zone between the core centers like Jerusalem and Ashkelon and so forth. So I'm interested in this medial space, the liminal zone. Now, this is what we're looking at. You can see these three valleys right down through here in this yellow area called the Shephelah on this map. And again, back to Joshua 15, you can see the breakdown of cities in the three districts of the Shephelah in this old district list in Joshua 15. And if you were to plot these cities on a map, you would find out that they follow very nicely the topography that we're looking at. My basic point is we're in the liminal zone. So how do we know whether we're in Hebrew territory or Philistine territory? This is Anson Rainey's drawing of the three districts, and Tel Zayit is right there. You can see it's very close to his border. More recently, more work has been done on these three districts by Blakely and Hardin. And you can see that they have expanded the line out a little bit. Now Tel Zayit is just inside the districts of Judah. Either way you go, we're right in that borderland area. This is the room right here that we were looking at a minute ago, the wall. This is the stone right there that we were talking about. It was discovered on the very last day of the season in 2005, and we all were quite excited. Now, a little bit about the archaeology. This is where the archaeology comes in. This is a beautiful archaeological context because it's so clear, and you could stand there. I could reconstruct the events that led to these deposits. This is that same room. I hope this is clear enough that you can see it. It's very nice on my screen right here. This is the room when we started excavating it, when we came to the top of it, of this deposit. And you may be able to see everything is badly burnt. It's orange, it's black, it has huge chunks of mud brick floating around in it. All of this stuff, including this wall that had the stone in it, all of that was smothered by this destruction debris. And then above that destruction debris, there were floor levels from the next phase up. So in other words, this debris was sealed and protected and was a primary context. This is a textbook case of a destruction by fire in this period. As we excavated down, we realized that part of the ceiling, this is a multi-story, at least a two-story building, we realized the ceiling and the ceiling makeup and the floor from the next story up had collapsed down into this room. Right here's a big block of that material. Here you can see, I hope, the thick floor. This is the second story floor, and these thin striations of the ceiling makeup, and then right here a very thin white sort of plaster looking layer. That's the ceiling for the downstairs room. As we excavated it, again, textbook case, that upper floor just popped right off this fallen debris. Now, here's in section what we just saw. Over here is a kind of round blackened area, something very botanical burned out there. I think this is the roof beam that came down with the house in this destruction. And once the ceiling came down, right here's the upstairs floor and the ceiling striations. Once the ceiling came down, of course, the whole structure is weak, and the exterior walls then came in. These walls, the superstructures, were made of mud bricks, and you can see bricks flying through the air here, as it were, as they came in and tumbled down on top of the collapse of the building. Now, all of this, as I said, covered and really just smothered that wall that the inscription was in. So, and then sealed by these later floors. That makes it a very good context for dating purposes. And the materials that we get out of this destruction debris become really valuable to me as an archaeologist for determining what culture we're looking at also. So it's not just chronological, it's cultural that we're trying, the questions that we're trying to solve here. Nice big brick right there, almost complete. It cracked when it fell, but in beautiful condition. Well, this is the kind of pottery that we find in the white areas here, like this right here. So-called Ashdod ware, these one-handled cooking jars from the coast, these large amphoras from the coast. This is a coastal-style cooking pot. That's the kind of pottery we find in the next level up. And I admit, this is coastal material. It's no doubt about it. So by the 9th century, this site had opened its doors to greater contact with the coast. I myself am impressed by the fact that the Bible says this is when Libnah rebelled against Jerusalem, turned its back on the hill country and aligned itself with the coast. If this site is not Libna, which I have made some noise about in some articles, and it may or may not be, I don't know, but if it's not Libna, it's close enough to Libna that it would have gone with Libna in terms of economics and politics and so forth. So this is the kind of pottery that we find in the next level up. When you look at the pottery that comes from the level of this inscription, it looks very different. And if you can see this, this is heavy courseware, thick slip, really dark red slip, hand burnishing, and really coarse burnishing. Now, this is classical, in my mind, classical 10th century material. Did it go into the early 9th century? Yes, probably. But the heyday for this kind of material is in the 10th century. We even get pattern burnishing. I don't know whether you can see that here because of the light on the screen. But burnishing in a pattern that looks like basket weaves and so forth. All very typical of Lakish Level 5, not too far from us. I think it's 10th century. We also have good radiocarbon dates. We found this cooking pot lying directly on the floor. I've cleaned out the cooking pot here, but it was full of botanical remains. I sent it away, and here's the results from Oxford. I hope you can see this. There is the spread for the dates, and if you can't see it, believe me, it's 10th century. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit earlier in the 10th century than I thought it would turn out to be. So this is not sort of going into the 9th century and borderline case. This is squarely in the 10th century. Now, when I look at the archaeology, that type of pottery, the second group of pottery that I showed you, that does not look coastal to me, that looks inland. So I think we're looking at the Hebrew culture here. I think the time period is pretty firm, so far as I can tell right now, 10th century. So I think this site was originally resettled after that long 200-year gap after the late Bronze Age, by the people from the highland culture, by the Hebrews who had, for one reason or the other, wanted to make a presence down here in the Shephelah, facing out toward Philistia. Now, something happened over the course of the next 100 years. By the 9th century, as I said, the people of this town did align themselves more closely with the coast, but that's 100 years later. In the 10th century, this is a highland site with that kind of pottery that I showed you. Now we come back to this inscription. Now that we have a date and a culture to talk about here, the problem with the inscription is that it's just letters. It's just the alphabet. It's the ABCs. And people who have heard a little bit about the inscription but don't know a lot about it often ask me, well, what did it say? Well, it didn't say anything. It said A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right through the alphabet, only in Hebrew, of course. Now, the problem is, if I gave you the toolkit right here, using our Latin alphabet today, if I gave that to you and said, this is what we have, now tell me what language am I talking about? Well, it would be problematic. You wouldn't know whether I was talking about English or German or French, in this case French first, French, German, Italian. If you're a really keen observer, you may point to letters like that and you say, ooh, that should be a clue to something there because I don't see that particular letter form in these other languages here. So that's what you have to do. You have to look really close at the letter formations and to try to determine what language this toolkit represents, or what language the toolkit would have worked with or provided a way to write longer texts. We even have, by the way, again, you probably can't see it here, we have found the points that I believe the scribe, if you will, used to incise this rock with these letters. One bronze point, one iron point. And the Bible has a number of references to engravers, when they were working with a hard medium, would use a pen of iron, it says in the Bible. Jeremiah 17, verse 1, Jeremiah is speaking to Judah, and he says, your sins have been engraved with a point of iron, which is bad news. You don't want your sins engraved with that. I want my sins written in ink so I can erase the record. But a point of iron incised in rock is a very permanent record, is what... not easily removed, is what Jeremiah, I think, is saying. So we even found some of the points that, in the same destruction level that scribes would have used to work in this hard medium. So here's the problem. If all you have is the alphabet, look, you don't have orthography, you don't have spelling of words, you don't have morphology. There are no nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. You don't have grammar. You don't have subjects and verbs. You don't have syntax, how a sentence might be put together. If we had an inscription that had all of these things, it would have been much, much easier to determine that this is Hebrew, not Phoenician, already that it's Hebrew. But we don't have any of these things because all we have is the toolkit. But that does leave us with something. That leaves us with one area that by which we can approach this challenge, and that is paleography, how the letter forms were made. I want to come back to a couple of sites here, Gezer, Izbit, Sarta. Okay. They put my program on this computer right here, so I see not all the fonts that were on my computer are on this computer. So some weird-looking letters there. But anyway, symbols. And Biblos up here. I want to mention just a couple of things that we have by which we can study the evolution of the alphabet, alphabetic script. We have an abecedaries from Ugarit in cuneiform writing system, but then we come to the late 12th century. This is the Izbit Sarta Ostracon. Actually, it's two ostraca. Originally, it was found in two pieces, and they realized they fit together. So now it has become an ostracon. And it's a practice text up here, but this line right here is the alphabet. I've separated it out down here for you. This is a late 12th century alphabet, probably Phoenician writing system. Interestingly, it still runs from left to right. This is the Aleph Beit over here, and it goes this way. Beyond that, we have the Tel Zayit abecedaries here and the Gezer calendar here. I will come back to those momentarily. Bill mentioned these inscribed arrowheads that we have. Again, the fonts are all confused here, but nothing I can do about that now. Anyway, these inscribed arrowheads. Over the course of the 11th century BC, we have a nice series of arrowhead inscriptions. And these are late Phoenician writing, and yes, everything is totally messed up here. But anyway, this arrowhead happens to refer to the Rab Eleph, which is a commander of thousands, 1,000, and I think that title is related to some of the titles that we have in the Bible, Sar Eleph, which is what David was appointed to when he went off to King Saul and so forth. Sar is a kind of commander or a prince of 1,000, a unit of 1,000. So we have that sort of thing on these arrowheads. My point is, paleographically, these arrowheads span the 11th century. So we have a nice sequence of script from the 11th century. And here is a script chart showing you some of the arrowheads, and then Tel Zayit is right here. This is our script that we have right here. So we have a lot of the 11th century forms that we can compare our script to. When we come down to the 10th century, which is the century that I've dated this script to, but farther north, up in Byblos, we have a number of royal Biblian inscriptions on sarcophagi and so forth. This happens to be the sarcophagus of a king named Ahiram. And interestingly, this sarcophagus was incised in two different areas. One inscription right around the top of the box, and one down the side of the lid. All kinds of interesting questions and so forth about this. You see right here that the inscription on the lid actually runs down into a broken area where somebody dropped the lid and broke it, and the inscription is still there down into the break, so that tells you the inscription was put on after it was broken. So all kinds of interesting questions about this inscription. But at the end of the day, what we have with this inscription and the other royal Biblian inscriptions from the 10th century is a nice set of letters that we can use for comparison. This is so ironic that I'm saying a nice set of letters, and you look at this gibberish and you say, okay, what's nice about that? Anyway, you get my point, I hope. Good comparative material here in the 10th century. Again, here are the royal Biblian inscriptions together with the Tel Zayit line right there. So good comparative material prior to the date of our inscription. You with me so far? After our inscription, we have the Gezer calendar. So we have good epigraphic material to compare our letters to, both before and after the time that to which I am dating our inscription. So here's our stone. Interestingly, this is the side with the inscription. On the back side, it had a ground-out hollow in it. So it raises an interesting question. How many lives did this rock have? How many different functions did this rock have over the course of its life? Eventually, it wound up in a wall in a building that was destroyed by the end of the 10th century. Now, can you see these letters right here? The line kind of sags down. There are actually two lines. Let me put the overlay in. There they are. And I'll take away the rock, and we'll talk about this inscription. As I said, I think this is a 10th century Hebrew alphabet that we're looking at. By the end of that arrowhead script, there was some stabilization in the use of an alphabet. Stabilization in the number of letters, the direction. By the end of that arrowhead sequence, everything is running in a Semitic alphabet from right to left, not left to right, the way we saw it in the Isbit-Sarta Ostracon. But number, direction, form, stance, and even the names of the letters, all of this is standardized by the time we come to the end of that arrowhead script. In terms of the names of the letters, this is an acrophonic alphabet. In other words, they got the names for letters from the beginning sound of certain words. So the word for ox was, in the old form, alpu, or aleph. And there's the ox, and that became the name of the first letter of the Semitic alphabet. And you can see how with time, as that letter changed its form, the way it was written, it becomes more stylized. You can see probably an ox head there, and it begins to rotate. Here they put the ears back on as well as the horn and the ox's muzzle. And if you keep rotating that on around, you can see your capital letter A. So all of the letters that in our Latin alphabet can be traced back to this Semitic alphabet that we have here from Tel Zayit. These letters, as has been mentioned, had in Hebrew there were only 22 consonants, and there were more consonantal phonemes or consonantal sounds than that in the overall Semitic world. So some of these Hebrew letters had to do double duty. Yeah, well. The example that I have on the board here, I was going to use the word Gaza. The territory of Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza. But anybody who's ever been to Israel and sees a road sign knows that Gaza begins with an ayin. That's because the ayin in Hebrew had to do double duty for the ayin in Proto-Semitic, but also another sound, the ghayin. It's a really rough G sound. So that's why the word Gaza begins with an ayin. Gomorrah, also Sodom and Gomorrah. Gomorrah begins with an ayin. So these letters were doing double duty by this time. And the alphabet that we have at Tel Zayit is transitional. This is my basic point here with the alphabet. It looks both back and forward. In looking back, we can see that the crossbar of the aleph sits back in the middle of the letter. In Phoenician and later writings, it's more out at the point of the letter. We can see that the head of the bait appears large and rounded versus a more triangular, sharply pointed head. Later Hebrew will generally prefer the Tel Zayit form. The gimel is very large and drawn at a near right angle. This is a very large gimel, which is the G in Hebrew. It's a very large gimel and drawn at nearly a right angle. Later Hebrew will also prefer this form, although Moabite will change a bit. The vav, or some people say wow, the vav, has a very large cup-shaped head on it. This is a very archaic feature for this letter. The chet is ladder-shaped, not the box shape that we see in other inscriptions. This is the ladder-shaped. The lamet is short, short downstroke and a tight curl on the lamed, another very archaic form from the 11th century arrowhead scripts. The nun is also very tight in the angles of its head there, has a long downstroke on it. And the scene sheen, this is another case where one grapheme had to do double duty for different sounds, but that's right here. This is large and kind of crude and very archaic in its shape. So these are all features of this alphabet that point back in time, and that this alphabet has brought forward from earlier writing systems, and especially the Gimel and the Vav, the Het, the Lamet, and so forth with these arrows out here. These are especially archaic features of this alphabet. This shows that this is an early alphabet. This is an old toolkit that we're looking at here. Having said that, this inscription looks forward too. If you look at the Zion, Professor Schniedewind made a couple of references to something that he said looks like an I-beam. The Zion here is symmetrical, it's broad, has a very short vertical stroke. This is against that earlier Phoenician, against those royal Biblian inscriptions. So in this letter, the Tel Zayit abecedary has moved on from Phoenician. The Kaf shows an elongated stem form and a little bit different trident head than what we see earlier on. The Mem, some people have said this letter right here, the M, looks the most modern, like the latest form of all in this inscription. And at first I went along with that. Yes, that's a very late-looking Mem. That looks like 9th century Hebrew already. But then we realized that that's partly a deception due to the sagging of this line. If you turn the rock around and you get the line more or less on a level playing field the way it should be, the Mem has a slightly different stance to it, and that Mem fits very well in the 10th century. So it's a little bit deceptive. I hope you can follow what I just said. The Mem is a little bit deceptive to base anything on here. The Tzadi is short and has a short vertical base that also looks forward in Hebrew. And there are a number of forms here, like the Aleph and the Vav and the Mem and the Nun, even the Pei. Look at that Resh with elongation, these long tails on them, which also represents a move away from Phoenician and toward what is going to become Hebrew, Moabite, and the regional dialects in the 9th century. So, these are, in this just short space, we have run through all of those letters one way or the other. The green letters in green look back in time. The letters in red are transitional or look forward in time. So I think what we have here is not a Phoenician alphabet. It's not yet a pure Hebrew alphabet of the Hebrew national script in the 9th century. It's a transitional script. I'm completely comfortable with the term Proto-Hebrew. Not everybody is, but I am, and that's the way I tend to think of this script. Interestingly, the scribe who put this on this rock, on 4 different occasions, had a metathesis. He reversed the order of the letters. So those of you who know Hebrew, you've got Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and then Vav, Hey. I think it should be Hey Vav according to the way I was taught Hebrew. And then Het Zion. Shouldn't it be Zion Het in today's standard Hebrew alphabet? On 4 different occasions, you know from your, those who don't know Hebrew, you know from your English alphabet that it's JKL, it's KL. Here it's LK, Lamed Kaf. So 4 times he reverses letters. And so you have to ask yourself, is this a mistake? Is this a neophyte scribe who's just practicing? He's working on his alphabet. He knows it, but not really. He makes constant mistakes. Or is this intentional? And the jury is out on that because 2 times, with the Pei and the Ayin and the Het and the Zion, we have parallels elsewhere. As a matter of fact, even in the Bible. If you look at acrostic poetry in all of these places in the Bible, in Psalm 10 and so forth, where they arrange the versification or the strophes of the poem, they identify them by letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The Bible will frequently go Pei Ayin rather than Ayin Pei. So there are parallels for 2 of these reversals, and for the other 2 reversals that I show you in the reddish color here, there are no known parallels for it. So it's 50-50 whether the scribe actually knows what he's doing or is making mistakes. This is a chart to break down the development of the Hebrew alphabet, and you can see that there's a tremendous amount of activity in the 10th century, and right there's where I would put our inscription, kind of leading down to 9th century Hebrew. One last thing about this inscription. I know you probably can't see this, but this rock was in a wall. There were rocks hanging out over top. And underneath this rock right here, if you can see that, there's one letter right there. This is what it looks like. Ayin Zayin Resh. Ayin Zayin Resh. And it's written up above the alphabet. It's very interesting to have 3 letters up there. The question is how to interpret it. Is it a noun? Ezer, meaning a helper. Is it a verb? Azor, an imperative, meaning help. Or is it a proper name? It probably would have been vocalized Azar. If it's a proper name, I wish they had put the theophoric element on it. Because if it's a Hebrew name, it would have been Azar Yahu. If it's a Phoenician name, it might have been Azar Baal. But the theophoric element is not there, just these 3 letters, which are kind of tantalizing. Well, we have a number of inscriptions from the 10th century. And the problem is they're very short, they're repetitive. Canaan, and this one's even off the screen, but that's Canaan also, the proper name, a very well-known name from this period in Hebrew. This is a 9th century inscription from Tel Zayit, but this is the main corpus right there. Very brief, and they only use certain letters of the alphabet. We have a handful of other very short inscriptions that have been dated to the 10th century, but I've excluded them from our study sample for various reasons. They're Aramaic, or they're clearly Phoenician, or their date to the 10th century is somewhat questionable, and so forth. So we really have very few inscriptions from the 10th century to look at, but what has happened now with these 3 major inscriptions, the Tel Kayafa, Ostrakhan, the Tel Zayit Abecedary, and the Gezer Calendar. Gezer Calendar was discovered already in 1908, the other 2 more recently, of course. We have an emerging sequence of script for this century that is so problematic in Israel, the 10th century. I've often had people ask me, do you think the 10th century really existed? And yes, I'm almost certain that the 10th century existed. The question is, what was there? And what were these people doing? And, of course, it became very popular, and still is in some circles, to say that they were illiterate. Even if somebody was there, they wouldn't have been able to write anything. And now we have an emerging script tradition that lines up in a sequence in this order. Tel Kayafa, Tel Zayit, and Gezer Calendar is the latest. The interesting irony is that inscription has a very clear archaeological context, but as Professor Schniedewind pointed out, it remains quite difficult to read. The Gezer Calendar can be read, but it really has a problematic archaeological context. As a matter of fact, I think it was found in the dumps at Gezer. The Tel Zayit Abecedary is the inscription that I think becomes the key one here, because it has such a clear archaeological context. And we can read it. I mean, it doesn't say anything. We can read the letters. We know that this is an alphabet. And so this is the way I line up the epigraphic sequence for the 10th century now. Kayafa, Tel Zayit, Gezer Calendar. It covers the entire century. And I think things are coming into focus a little bit for us in the 10th century, slowly, slowly. Now, we're down on the periphery. Remember, we're back in the liminal zone. So if this kind of writing is going on there, I have no reason to doubt that there were people who could write at this time period in Jerusalem as well. Professor Schniedewind is right. Everything is overlaid with gold, according to the Bible. Now, I think this was, as I call it down here, an emergent patrimonial kingdom based on kinship ties. But it was the core, if you will, of what was going to become the great kingdom of Judah. And I think it was there already by the 10th century. And why we haven't found more inscriptions from Jerusalem from the 10th century is a problem. It's a conundrum I can't explain. I can only say just keep digging. We'll end with Tel Zayit, and a friend of mine at the site there. I always like to get him in. We have a couple of study seasons coming up this year, including an excavation season this summer, so maybe we'll have more information to share with you later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. If you do study these things, you'll find that the discovery Professor Tappy and his crew made is truly one of the landmark events in archaeological history on these issues, and it's a real honor to have him here to tell us about it. If you will mic up Professor Millard. Alan Millard will be our guest speaker tomorrow night. He has an illustrious career. I will give a full introduction to him tomorrow, but for today, I will bring him to the podium so that he can comment on the presentations that have been made thus far. And then before we conclude, we've asked Professor Tove to kind of give us a glimpse into the scribal practices during the Dead Sea scroll inscription period. So that'll range several hundred years, and I'll let him explain that when he gets ready. But I want to give a short introduction to him before that. You are still... you're switching computers, so Okay, so Professor Millard, if you would come up and get started, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're grateful to Mark for his hospitality and these splendid structures he's erected. But it's what goes on inside them that matters most. And you've been hearing 3 very competent, erudite lectures. I have to comment on them. Well, we'll start with the last one because it's most fresh in our minds, and we're very pleased that Ron Tappy made the discovery of this stone. One of the things that has interested me, and I haven't yet had opportunity to ask him, is how easy it was for somebody to scratch those letters on the stone. It doesn't seem to me that they just scratched and it was done. It must have taken some effort, and that makes me wonder why it was done. Well, he just showed us those 3 letters higher up on the stone, Ein, Sein, Resh, which read help. And clearly the letters are not all in the right order. Some of them are slightly odd shapes, and I think it was probably some pupil scribe who'd forgotten to do his assignment properly, and he just tried to write it out in a hurry before the school teacher came along and asked him what he thought. Ron has explained to us that the form of the letters may be described as transitional. I have always thought that letters we find engraved on stone are a little less advanced than what we would see if we had writing on in ink on leather or papyrus. And I suspect that those 3 inscriptions from the 10th century that he's been showing us are not an archaic, but a slightly older form of the script that was actually in use in the chancery in Jerusalem, for example. The mixture of different signs, some looking older than others, is something we find in 1 or 2 other inscriptions. One I was involved with in Aramaic shows the same sort of thing. When it was first discovered, people wanted to date it as early as the 12th century BC. I believe it dates from the middle of the 9th century, and that opinion has now become the received opinion. It does have forms which are archaic. It does have some which are later. Proto-Hebrew? Well, it could be, but as Ron pointed out, the letters of our Roman alphabet are used for many different languages. But did you notice he put an example up in French and another in Italian? Neither of those languages uses the letter W. So if we found the alphabet written in France or Germany with a W in it, we would think it was written by a German or a Briton. So sometimes there are differences, but as regards the, let's say, Proto-Hebrew alphabet, we don't find such differences. And that takes me back to Dr. Schniedewind's lecture, where, like Ron Tappy, he showed us the bronze arrowheads. It is a very strange phenomenon. we have, I think, now 60 bronze arrowheads engraved, arrowhead of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, or with a title, chief of 1,000 or whatever it might be. They only come from the 12th to 10th centuries BC, mostly 12th and 11th. What was it, the purpose of writing your name on an arrowhead? Again, it wasn't something you could just scribble on. They're incised in the bronze, in some cases with something like the tip of a very small screwdriver, so that you get straight lines rather than curves. So somebody had to take the arrowhead and go along putting the names. I was struck, and in the essay that Professor Hoffmeier referred to at the beginning, I commented on this, struck by the fact that about the same time, slightly earlier, going on slightly later, in Babylonia, we have a number of arrowheads engraved, usually with kings' names, in cuneiform. We also have swords with kings' names in cuneiform. Why engrave an arrowhead with your name? Did you shoot it in battle, go round of the battlefield afterwards, pulling out the arrowheads and saying, that's yours, that's mine? Did you collect them up and say, these belong to this squadron and these belong to that squadron? Of course, only one in 100 or 1,000 would have a name on it. I think that they were votive gifts. Either before the battle, you left one in a temple with a prayer that you might live and be victorious, or more likely after the battle, you left one saying, thank you, God, for the victory, thank you for keeping me alive. But there's no way we can prove this, because none of them, except for one, have ever been found in an archaeological context. It's a very sad thing that they have all been sold on the antiquities market, devoid of their provenance. The one that was found in a tomb in Lebanon, and it's not clear whether that was its original position. It may have been put there after use. And again, they've all come through the antiquities trade and seem to have been found in southern Syria or Lebanon. There were 4 said to come from a place near Bethlehem, but how certain that is, we don't know. That's what the dealer said, and dealers often say what they think you'd like to hear. So these arrowheads are fascinating and continue to be a source of discussion. I'm not going to talk about the Hubert-Kayafa ostracon today, because I shall talk about it tomorrow, nor about the material from Kuntunet Adrud, which has just been published complete. I haven't seen the volume yet, but is very significant in many ways. Based on that material and others, Dr. Schniedewind argued that it was Israelite activity in the Negev that produced these materials. And he argued for a development of administration there before the time of Solomon. I wasn't quite sure whether he meant therefore in the time of David or earlier than David, in which case my question would be, who was responsible for the administration, which was obviously centralized to some extent. And if we follow the book of Judges, before the time of David, well, we have King Saul, but before that, probably not a situation where you would get a wide-ranging centralized administration. So that's something that I would like to hear a little more about. Then he raised the question, why do we only find the alphabet of 22 letters wherever we find it from the 12th century BC onwards? That is, in southern Syria, Lebanon, and throughout the Holy Land. And he suggested the answer was through the mercantile activities of the Phoenicians, and that seems to me to be a very strong likelihood. We should remember, and we saw a little from Professor Tappy's map, that the number of inscriptions is relatively small, and there are large areas from which we have no inscriptions. That, I think, does not mean people there were not writing, it's simply that we haven't found them. And again, as I shall emphasize tomorrow, most writing was done on perishable materials. so we shall never find most of what was written. But if we had writing from more sites, we might find more slight variations in letter forms, in orders of the letters in the alphabet, and so forth. Now, if you can cast your minds back to Professor Hoffmeier's lecture, one of the questions he raised was why was the cuneiform writing script dominant in Canaan, when even Canaan was under nominal Egyptian control. I think to understand this, we have to go back into the 3rd millennium BC, when Babylonian influence spread into Syria, and at the site of Ebla, which was famous a few years ago and is still very important, hundreds of cuneiform tablets have been found written with the cuneiform script about 2300 BC or slightly later. And amongst those tablets there are tablets which were used for educational purposes, with lists of Babylonian words and place names, and these are identical with copies found in Babylonia proper. So the educational system had spread right up into Syria. But Ebla was destroyed sometime before 2200 BC, and we don't have any more examples from Western Syria or Syria-Palestine until about 2000 BC, when there's a single tablet from Byblos. Again, it's significant because it is an educational tablet. It's a list of cuneiform signs. It's not a letter or something exciting like a myth about the gods of Byblos. So the Babylonian writing system was entrenched in the Levant from the second half of the 3rd millennium BC onwards. And the consequence was that we find cuneiform tablets in Babylonian in the 18th century BC at Hatzor, and in the 15th and 14th centuries BC in the Late Bronze Age at a number of sites, and the famous letters, of which we saw a couple on the screen, sent by rulers of Canaanite towns to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Well, of course, simultaneously, the Egyptians were writing on papyrus and leather and wooden tablets, and if they were left in ruins in Canaanite cities, we wouldn't find them. We do have examples like the stele we saw of pharaonic monuments set up in Egyptian in the Holy Land, and we also have a small number of potsherds with Egyptian inscriptions on them, tax receipts and similar things, apparently fragments from the administration of the Egyptian colonial rule in Canaan. But it was the cuneiform script which seems to have been more widely used, and I suspect the reason for that was partly that Egyptian was normally written on papyrus, and that had to be imported from Egypt. People living in Canaan didn't make papyrus rolls there. They had to buy them from Egypt. Well, we know they were sent to Byblos, but that may be a different question, why they were not imported into Egypt, into Canaan. Well, those kingdoms in Canaan, if we can call them kingdoms, were not very wealthy places. They may simply not have been able to afford papyrus, or perhaps to pay an Egyptian-trained scribe. As for Moses' writing, well, we'll come back to that tomorrow evening. The fact that Egyptian weights and measures are found in use in the Hebrew Bible is a very interesting one, but that's only half the story, because some of the Hebrew weights and measures are Babylonian, and you find the two together. The mina and the talent are Babylonian, and the shekel, of course, is a Semitic term common to Babylonia and to the Canaanites. The very interesting practice of Hebrew scribes to write numbers with the Egyptian hieratic numeral system is one that has occasioned some debate, and a German scholar collected all the examples together a couple of years ago in a volume in which he argues that it only came into use in the 8th century BC in Israel. But I think, as Dr. Hoffmeier showed, there may be one or two examples from earlier date, and it would seem to me unlikely in the 8th century that they should suddenly adopt an Egyptian style for writing numbers. We know the Phoenicians and the Arameans used a different system, more like our Roman number system. They didn't use the Egyptian system. I think this was a legacy the Hebrew scribes inherited from their Canaanite forebears. And finally, I can't answer the question why we have no bullae, little lumps of clay with seal imprints from the late Bronze Age in Canaan, except that archaeologists may have overlooked them. It's only in the last 30 years or so that Hebrew bullae, and you saw a collection on the screen, have come to light in considerable numbers. 5 or 6 were known before the 1970s, but since then, considerable quantities, in fact hundreds, have come to light. Again, a large number on the antiquities market. Now, these things are as small or smaller than your thumbnail. They're clay, usually just dried in the sun. One side might have the imprints of papyrus fibers, the other side the imprint of the seal. And if you're not alert for such things, you'll overlook them. Nowadays, archaeologists in the Holy Land sift the soil they dig up because they want to find them. But that's a fairly recent innovation, and I suspect that others may have gone unnoticed, and that may explain why we have none from the late Bronze Age and very few from the early part of the Iron Age. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Hoffmeier, Dr. Schniedewind, and Dr. Tappy for their presentations, which have stimulated and instructed me, and I hope they've done the same for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We look forward to tomorrow night while we wire up Professor Tove. Emmanuel Tove is world-renowned authority on so many matters about the Hebrew Bible. He's our scholar in residence right now. He is also one of the principal translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls and overseers of the translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and has been for decades. It was so interesting to me to have a chance to visit with both Professor Tove and Weston Fields, who oversees the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, and they were discussing the various scrolls and various questions and where the scrolls came from, and some recently discovered, or some scrolls that have just recently come on to the academic scene and the market. And it was so fascinating to hear Professor Tove. He's able to identify the handwriting of various scroll fragments and say, well, this one was written by the scribe who also wrote that one. And his knowledge and depth of understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls is unsurpassed. So we're honored to have him here and ask him if he would take just a few moments and give us sort of a look-see into the scribal techniques or the scribal information that he particularly is aware of in the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So with that, Professor Tove, thank you.
So we now go 600-700 years forward, not back. And we look at the texts that were written in Palestine as a whole, and at Qumran and other sites at the Judean desert. The texts that I will be talking about are biblical and non-biblical, and they were written down, they were penned down between something like the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era and the year 70. I've written a book on this. It's called Scribal Practices reflected in the text found in the Judean desert. And so what I can do in these few minutes is less than a summary. Here were the most fragments found at Qumran in cave number 4. Now, what is a scroll? A scroll is one piece of leather called a sheet, combined with another piece of leather, and you roll it. We just heard the word Megillah. I didn't know about its Egyptian parentage, but it also has a very good Semitic Hebrew etymology. You roll it, you can see it from the beginning, the middle, and the end. The most important scrolls were stored in jars like these. We call them scroll jars, because this shape is known only for the storage of scrolls. This is disputed, not all agree. Each jar could house more than one scroll. Which scrolls in particular were housed in these jars, we do not know, because it is not archaeologists who found the scrolls, but the first scrolls, as you know, were found by Bedouin. The most important scrolls were covered with a cover sheet with or without patterns on it. The scrolls found at Qumran and also in the other sites were written in three main languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, using the same script. And for Hebrew we have mostly the square Hebrew script, but we also have some 15 or so written in the ancient Hebrew script. Here you have a sample of the Aramaic script. This is a Greek letter scroll found in Nahal Gever, one of the sites south of Qumran. It is a beautiful scroll, published by myself in DJD Volume 8. And this is a script that most of you will probably not know, will not have heard about it. Those of you who know a little Hebrew will try to decipher it, but you won't be able to do so. This is the cryptic script, very intriguing, with letters that look a little bit like the square Hebrew, more like the ancient Hebrew script, and most letters are actually just letters, signs that were invented. These scrolls were written for the purpose you may guess they were written for, namely to inscribe secret writings, probably by the teacher of righteousness to the new members of the Qumran community. Scrolls and fragments were found not only at Qumran, which is the major site of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also on top of the Masada mountain and at some 4 sites other sites south of Qumran. The very interesting place you see now is the synagogue on top of the Masada, and there in 2 different pits under the ground a scroll or fragments of a scroll of Ezekiel and fragments of a scroll of Deuteronomy were found. This is a Jewish custom called Gniza, of storing sacred writings that are not in use anymore, that cannot be used anymore in sacred service, not to throw them away, but to bury them or store them in a gniza, in this case under the ground. Now, in the different sites in the Judean desert, we find material, different material used for writing. There is papyrus, which at Qumran is a minority, and there's leather, which is the majority. And there is one item also on copper. We've seen in the earlier slides that this papyrus plant the stem was sliced into pieces and they were laid horizontally and vertically and then inscribed. Now, the interesting thing is that in all the sites other than Qumran and Masada, the majority of the material was papyrus, like Nachal Hever, Morbat, mostly papyrus. And at Qumran, the majority was leather. Now, this goes together with the nature of the collections found there. At Qumran, it is mostly literary material, like biblical scrolls, and in Nachal Hever and Morbat, this is mostly documentary material, like the fragment you see here, that is documents of marriage, of divorce, of shopping list, land ownership, etc. A single item, the copper scroll, a list of the temple treasures, remains a riddle until today. Many books and tens of articles have been written on this scroll, and here I show to you just as writing material. Now, the approaches of scribes towards that text. Basically and roughly, you can say the texts were written either very carefully or sloppily or very sloppily. Yes, there were many quite sloppily written documents by inexperienced scribes. Some say even ones by a child. Now, what I'm saying is about the non-biblical material and also about the biblical material. This is a beauty. You can't see it so easily, but it is a beauty. Beautiful letters, straightly written, large margins on the top and the bottom, exact writing from the point of view of the content, exact writing of the Masoretic text, the text that we use until today. And I call this a luxury Bible manuscript. So this is a precise and careful approach of scribes. And this was continued until the Middle Ages. So what you now see is not a Dead Sea Scrolls, but a medieval manuscript of the Hebrew Bible, one of the several beauties we have. Now, this is not a biblical scroll, and I give this as an example of writing with many corrections. Quite a few. Sometimes the earlier text was erased, sometimes what we call cancellation dots were written below and above, and sometimes the text was just written above the writing. So look at this case here. The text here speaks, as you can all read, you all read fluently Hebrew. The text says, whoever bears a grudge to his fellow man in the community shall be punished for 6 months. Good enough. But then the corrector says, no, that's not enough. He says 1 year. And there are similar corrections in this scroll. Mind you, this is the community rule. This is the rule by which this community at Qumran was living. Now, for me, this is an example of texts that were written and corrected, where we have several copies of this community rule, and we can follow the writing and the correcting by scribes, whom you might call scribes editor. We earlier showed a sample of papyrus. This is a modern depiction of how hides of animals were prepared to form parchment for writing. Something similar must have been done at Qumran. We still have the basins where those hides were being prepared, except I don't know whether they had also a frame like this. Now, when a hide was prepared for writing. They used a geometrical shape which they cut out of the hide, or several of course, as much as you can get from the size of the animal. And then there were at the borders there were all kinds of shapes that could not be used immediately for writing because it's too small and they're just fragments. Now what you see here is such a remnant that from the borders of an animal hide. Was not thrown away, it was also used for writing. So what you see here is not a fragment, this is the actual shape as it came of the large hide. And it was used for a very interesting purpose, this one. It was used for a phylactery, which is a ceremonial Jewish object that is used from old times. It's mentioned also in the New Testament. Until today, you put it on your left arm here or on your forehead, actually both. And it has in 4 little pouches, it has little fragments, 4 pericopes from Exodus and Deuteronomy. And this is one of those texts. Very unneat, you might say. Well, this was prepared at Qumran according to their customs. We also have very neat such phylacteries written more like the Masoretic text. This is a little quite wild spelling, etc. Now, a scroll is composed of sheets. In front of you, you have 2 such sheets from the Deuteronomy scroll. Very unusual sheet, which has only 1 column. This hardly, if ever, occurs. Normally, you would have 3 or 4 columns on a sheet. This one is larger, has 5 columns. These sheets were first inscribed, were then stitched together. In this case, you can see the stitching with different materials, usually animal, I don't know the word, but tendons, I think it's called, tendons, and sometimes with flax, but normally animal tendons. And you can see this here very clearly. Also look at the lines about which I will say something in a while. On these sheets, the columns were prepared and each column was ruled. Ruling means that the lines were drawn from the right to the left. And the writing was applied to the scroll, not on the line as we do, but always under the line. Now what is interesting here is that you see that these lines are not so neatly drawn, and there's actually one line that is superfluous. It was not inscribed. And what we saw in the previous one is that this is one sheet. Oh, this is one sheet, and this is another sheet. So they came from a different origin. And this sheet was inscribed with lines, as you see, also in the top margin. This can only mean that this sheet was prepared originally for a larger scroll, and then used for a smaller scroll, so that the top margin remained with this ruling. Scribes were very important in Qumran because they wrote the literary compositions that were read by the others. They were very important in ancient Israel as a whole. And they had to learn their trade. In earlier presentations here, you saw some abecedaries, and also one of these has been found in Qumran. This particular abecedary was not found in the caves of Qumran, but it was found in one of the community buildings. And you can clearly see how this scribe tried out his way. You see the letters Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and also the other ones. Now, scribes also wrote all kinds of exercises. They had to learn their trade. And this particular document, 4Q 341, is in a way famous and infamous. It was published first by John Allegro, and also later on Charles Worth repeated his views. It was first called 4Q Therapia. And John Allegro thought that this document was, yes, written in Hebrew, but it was not Hebrew actually, because he couldn't understand the document. He thought it was actually Greek, because here you have the word Magnus, well, which is not actually Greek, but he thought the whole document was Greek. Later, Navet published the actual meaning of this document. It's a scribal exercise, and it simply is a list of names, so there's no meaning to it. And you see, these are names starting with a mem: Magnes, Malkoach, Manis, Machtush, etc. They all start with an mem, with an M. This is an exercise. Scrolls were written by single scribes. Sometimes two wrote parts of the same scroll. Even this little document was written by two different hands. We don't understand exactly why, but at the top part you see larger letter than at the bottom. And this is a more clear case in my view, but I should say not everyone agrees. This is the large Isaiah scroll. Until this column, we see, so we start from the right, so this column, this is the area of the first scribe. And he didn't, can you all see this? He didn't quite complete his writing. He left 3 lines uninscribed. Well, he had to do so because the second one started here at the beginning of a sheet. Now, the difference between the two scribes of the large Isaiah scroll is in handwriting, but also in orthography spelling. The spelling of the second one was much fuller than that of the first. And we have all kinds of strange spellings, more in the second part than in the first part. Scribe used ink. And again, here I learned something from Jim. It may well be an Egyptian word, who knows? Joe. And the ink at Qumran was mainly based on burnt plants, carbon. But some were metallic. And the metallic ink, as you see here, corroded, and it ate through the document. I'm glad they used this technique only, maybe we only have some 5, 6 scrolls that are written in this way. They are a sincere challenge for us scholars. Ink was normally black, in this case red. We saw also earlier in Egypt this red ink was used. Several places ink was used. According to one research, this ink has certain material in it that was brought all the way from Spain. Red ink was used maybe only in 3-4 scrolls for headers. or special details that needed to be stressed. This is the beginning of a paragraph. Inkwells. Where did they write? Please remember that a great deal of the scrolls found at Qumran were brought from the outside. Mere theory, but it's my theory, so it counts. 2/3, in my view. 1/3 was written on the spot. Undoubtedly, scrolls were written on the spot. The only question is how many. So this room, if you go there today, there will be a neat signed Qumran scriptorium. Whether it was or not, we don't know. But in this particular room, benches and tables were found. At least that's what we think they were. And also 2 inkwells. And it makes sense that they were seated there. These are the benches and tables, according to some scholars, too low to write on. Because the question is this document, or shall we say modern painting, by a family member of myself, is this a correct depiction of the writing, namely at tables? I happen to disagree with my wife, because I think they wrote more on their knees like the Egyptian scribes. In fact, someone wrote a paper stating that they were tables for writing were not invented before the 4th or 5th century, so they could not have been writing in this way. Texts were written continuously. Poetry texts like Psalms were written in a sticographic arrangement, in a poetic arrangement, sometimes even with different couplets indicated, like here, with spaces between the couplets. Columns were sometimes very narrow, like in this list of dates, and sometimes were wide, like in this document. The name of God, special care was taken, not in all text, but maybe in 1/4 of the text, to write the name of God in a special ways. One way is like here, to write it with ancient Hebrew characters. In this way, you can make sure that you will not erase it, because that was forbidden. So the previous one was actually Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. This one is El, God. Another way for making sure that reverence is paid to the divine names is writing 4 dots for the Tetragrammaton. Even in some ancient Greek texts of the Septuagint, the name of God is written in ancient Hebrew characters. So this is clearly a Jewish copy of the Septuagint translation. This is a very special case. Mistakes were made, obviously. Some stayed in the text and some were corrected. In this particular mistake, a line was omitted. A line was omitted, and it was added between the lines in a rather sloppy writing, and here down in the margin. You can describe, incidentally, we know who he is, we think. We think this is the text of Scribe B, the second scribe, and the correction is by someone else, as we can tell from the handwriting and the spelling. And this scribe, who uses here 4 dots, unlike elsewhere in this scroll, is the same scribe, we think, as the one who copied a Samuel scroll, 4Q Samuel C, and the community rule from Cave 1. He writes here 4 dots for the name of God, and here dots under the word, but these are different dots. These are dots to cancel this word. In this case, a Jeremiah scroll, also a mistake was made, and there wasn't much room, so the letters were corrected. They were inserted between the lines in very small script, between the line, in the margin, and in the bottom here. Scribes used signs. We don't understand all the signs. Some of them, I think, are sectarian for their writing of the Isaiah scroll, for example. Here's an X sign. Different views. I think it simply indicates the end of the line. Here you have 4 times the sign of a fish hook, indicating new paragraphs. Sometimes the letter was repaired with little patches like we do on jeans. This is a little round patch on an Exodus scroll, and you can still see the stitching holes for this patch. Scrolls needed to be fastened, and for the fastening they used little fastening devices that were stuck to the scroll, and little thongs around it. These are the ones that have been preserved. And in this case you can still see it attached to the scroll. And we've come to the end of our story, and I just remind you that all that we Dead Sea scholars do is we look at little fragments and we try to compose of them the whole picture by reconstructing. And if there are any Dead Sea Scrolls scholars here, see what may happen to you if you're not careful.
Thank you very much. We have run the gamut of our time. I leaned over to Professor Millard and I said, if we don't have time for a Q&A, would you like to make comments about Professor Tov's presentation? He said, just to admire his work. And this is truly the work of a lifetime. The gentlemen that we have had present to us today are fantastic scholars in their field. You may have questions. If you do, let me urge you to consider tomorrow night. If you have not reserved a spot for the lecture, let Charles or Emily know, and we'll figure out how to find you room for the lecture. But after the lecture tomorrow night, we have a reception in the library, and all of these gentlemen that have presented will be there, several of them with their wives, the better halves, including the artist who thinks that she has Professor Tov's wife is there too, and she draws some tremendous art, and frankly, I'm going with her on this artistic thing regardless. But these scholars will be with their wives and would be delighted to answer your questions and to speak with you. They are teachers as well as scholars at heart. And so if you want that opportunity, we'll do it tomorrow night. In the meantime, would you join me in one last set of applause for them? Special thanks, of course, always to our library staff, but especially to Jim Hoffmeier who realized with the scholars that come into these presentations said, Lanier, why don't we make them work a little bit on Friday and give a presentation? And I said, great. I don't have time to put it together. And he said, I will. So Jim has really taken the bull by the horns to do this. Special thanks to you, Jim, and very much appreciated. Thank you each for coming. And these gentlemen will probably talk to you now if you want to ask them cold. But class dismissed.